Audrey Yue is Senior Lecturer in Cinema and Cultural Studies at the University of Melbourne. Her publications include the forthcoming Song of Exile, which is the Hong Kong University Press publication, Asia Pacific Queer, Rethinking Genders and Sexualities, University of Illinois Press, and Mobile Cultures, New Media in Queer Asia, Duke University Press. She's currently Chief Investigator in 2 ACR grant-funded projects on Asian Australian cinema and transnational large screens. So welcome, Audrey Yue.
I want to provide a kind of a survey of contemporary representations of Chinese sexuality, and I want to talk about literature, film, popular television, and to discuss these new changing representations in relation to historical traditions, but also how they have emerged as a result of the globalization of China. And what I want to show really is to show how representations of changing sexualities are symbolic of a changing China. The image that you see there, I went to Shanghai in 2007. On my way home at the airport, I took this photo. This was one of those huge advertising, sort of lining up the aisle, transit lounge at the airport. So the new kind of sexuality I'm kind of trying to talk about is this. I think is encapsulated in the image. The women, both are women. One woman with the short hair wearing a tie, kind of almost masculine representation, looking almost lovingly at the other woman with long hair. Long hair also signifies femininity, but the long pants signifies a new kind of independence. So here, sort of that kind of new androgyny is what I want to kind of talk about. But before I do that, just a kind of quick overview of contemporary China since China opened its doors in 1979 and its ascension to the WTO in 2001. We are seeing a new kind of China. It's what we call a kind of post-socialist China. So bureaucratically, in terms of government, it's still a communist structure, but everything else underneath is a market economy. So we have the state and the market contesting each other. And alongside that, Western influences coming in with commerce, marketization, commercialization, and also regional culture, East Asian popular cultural flows all coming into this kind of an economy. And, alongside that in urban centers, what you see too amongst the kind of contemporary generation of people is a new kind of mood or a sentiment, or almost a kind of postmodern malaise, if you like. These people have grown up in cities where they see traditions almost torn down overnight, replaced by skyscrapers. So that's that kind of the milieu I'm trying to kind of plot and to give you a sense of this kind of changing representation. So the first one is at the level of popular literature, the rise of beauty writers. So beauty writers, the 3 women up there, Wei Hui is probably the most famous. Beauty writers are really authors who are themselves beautiful women. So you have the rise of this kind of writing in early 2000, and sort of so these women have grown up in the 70s. They're born in the 70s, grown up with no idea of the Cultural Revolution, and very much kind of urban centered, if you like. And their writings are very much characterized by a kind of explicit foregrounding of a new liberal femininity. So very sexualized, very sexually explicit, kind of description, dealing with sex and drugs and prostitution, and so on and so forth. And a lot of it is also partly autobiographical. That's why a lot of Chinese scholars have called this type of writing body writing, literally using the body, flaunting the body, using the body to express themselves, to style the writing, and also expressing private thoughts, private sensations, and so on, and so forth. Their writings have circulated on the internet. They're very famous, popular with the Generation X, kind of readers, and they are sometimes also called celebrity writers, because what they do is, they harness forces of marketization, commercialism, and the internet, and kind of, use all these forces in their writing, to kind of sexually explicit kind of prose to create a media sensation so that they then become celebrities. So the rise of media celebrities we start to see in China, and a new representation of liberal femininity. And on top of that, you start to see, so these things are happening, but also these writings they're all banned in the state by the state. The state considers this kind of writing immoral, decadent, distasteful, and of course this kind of banned in China label always has a new kind of international marketabilities, and it sells more in the West. As a result of that, the rise of this kind of beauty writing, also we start to see the demise of traditional Chinese literature, the demise of Chinese intellectuals. So previously the Chinese writer was very much a kind of the voice of the people, the conscience of the state, writing about, the architect of the soul, about the nation state. So, this kind of new project is very much about liberal, kind of liberalization, self-expression, a new kind of liberal femininity. Wei Hui, the most famous author, now lives in Shanghai and New York. Shanghai Baby sold, I think, 6 million copies, the highest grossing, sort of contemporary Chinese literature ever, and it's translated into 34 languages, distributed into 45 countries. And the story, it's almost semi-autobiographical. The story revolves around the kind of narrator, Coco. Coco has two lovers, a Chinese lover and a German lover. The Chinese lover is impotent, right? So she writes of her sexual frustration, she writes of masturbation. The German lover, on the other hand, is very virile. So she writes about experimental sex, with this kind of foreigner. And I think it's just about this kind of virility of the German foreigner that kind of, created a kind of furor with the state. It's like as if all Chinese men are impotent, kind of typified by the story of the book. So just to give you a snippet from the novel, and in the quote there, it just kind of talked about all these, sort of high class, highly educated, sort of Shanghai women, but at a party, all of them look really tarty, and and she's kind of gesturing to the fact that they must all be thinking about sex in their head. So that's Shanghai Baby, and Chunshu, very much Beijing-based, born in the 1980s, and voice of kind of her generation. So she kind of writes what we call the kind of Linglei literature, alternative counterculture literature, about the group of young people growing up in the 80s in urban centers and they come from kind of non-privileged background, non-elite background, and their world's very much a world of rock and roll, and they're kind of seduced by punk, and punk becomes their way to kind of evoke freedom and liberalism. Her book Beijing Doll, very famous as well, talks about the kind of coming of age of this young adolescent girl, but her kind of naive but very sexually promiscuous, kind of relationships with a lot of anonymous men. And Mian Mian also now doubles up as a kind of event organizer. Mian Mian's protagonists, right, are always, they're junkies, they're prostitutes, they're dealers, they're pimps. She writes about gangsters. She writes about, the new Chinese underbelly. This is what happens, on the flip side of modernization. This is what happens on the flip side of globalization. People who are left by the wayside in the march towards progress. And I've got another quote here too. This is in Mian Mian's first novel, La La La, where the character talks about, the first time she has sex with this anonymous man in the toilet. So here, then, at the level of literature, a new kind of beauty writing, a new generation writing, kind of expressing liberal femininity, the rise of celebrity writers, and the demise of national literature as Chinese literature. So my second example is Chinese cinema. It's cross-dressing and transsexuality. All of you are very familiar with Chinese film, no doubt. And the first film to be exported to the West, the first film to find international acclaim in the West in the modern era is this 1993 film, Chen Kaike's film, Fellow My Concubine. And Chen Kaike belongs to what we call the fifth generation of filmmakers. So the first group to have gone to film school after the revolution, Cultural Revolution, the first group to have made films after China opened its doors. So the first group of films to be circulated to the West. And the West was obviously not only intoxicated by this kind of epic, kind of traditions in the film, but also the motif of cross-dressing, right? So, the first Chinese film to be successful in the West has a subtext of cross-dressing and a subtext of homosexuality. And so the film revolves around sort of two boys, spanning period of 1920s to 1970s, and, their kind of life in the opera school, how they train together, how they perform on stage together in a very famous Chinese opera called Fellow My Concubine, The Emperor and the Concubine. This is a Tie character played by Leslie Chung, the late Hong Kong actor, gay icon. Very interesting kind of character in the film. Tie is homosexual. He has sex with men, and when he was training as a young boy, every day he has a mantra to say, I must be like a woman. I am a woman. I am a woman. So this is kind of Tie character. So the film then kind of blurs the boundary between acting and real life in the film, but also that's kind of gender ambiguity. What is man? What is a woman? So the film explicitly foregrounded that, and I think it was this kind of gender ambiguity that it will cause the film to be banned in China. Explicitly, the film showed the Communist Party in a bad light, but implicitly, it was using the story of this intimate relationship between these two men, to tell the story of the epic story of China, the story of China in transition from the 1920s to the 1970s. So gender ambiguity became almost symbolic for kind of identity confusion in the kind of nationhood of China, if you like. We can think about it in that way. So very controversial in all sorts of ways. And the last controversy was that the character of Tie and the concubine opera was actually based on a real life character, Mei Lanfang. Mei Lanfang is actually Beijing's most famous opera star. He lived from sort of, I think, 1894 to 1961. And he was the one who nationalized Chinese opera. He was the one who brought Chinese opera to different parts of the world. And he was very much held as a national icon. And in 2008, the same director made a bioepic about Mei Lanfang. And so the Chinese government, also held Mei Lanfang as very much a kind of a cultural pride, a national icon. The stamps, sort of in his image. And in 2009, with his birthday, the Chinese government commemorated with a new Google icon with Mei Lanfang on there. So you see how the theme of cross-dressing and Chinese, kind of transsexuality became not just a way for the film for films to be exported internationally and for China to gain acclaim, but also, a kind of art form such as, Chinese opera can become, and using the motif of cross-dressing can become a source of national pride in China. So a few forces here we're talking about. The first one, obviously, is the kind of force of there's a historical tradition of cross-dressing in Chinese opera. And here you see the photo of the real-life Mei Lanfang and in the kind of feminine role, right? So, and the feminine role, the male-to-female cross-dressing on stage is called Nandan. Nandan is a Chinese translation, male-female combining together. So you have then, these forces, sort of have resulted as a result of the new force of historical tradition, the new force of Chinese opera as a source of renewed pride, even in the era of internet revolution. But also all these have impacted on social movement, the gay and lesbian social movement in China. In the last 5 years, we start to see a new kind of emerging, queer subculture happening not just in the major first-tier cities of Shanghai and Beijing, but also second-tier cities as well. And here I've got pictures of, sort of Shanghai had a gay pride march last year for the first time. Beijing now is into its fourth queer film festival, and that the last image is an image of a flyer for a club night for Shanghai. You see the kind of images of the kind of gay masculinity very much modeling after the West. But Chinese queer movement is slightly different to the West, right? It imports the cultures of the West in the kind of rainbow icon and the kind of new new masculinity, but also localizes it with the Chinese tradition. So the Chinese word for queer is actually tongzhi, right? That's why you see comrades here, right? So tongzhi is a kind of same-sex coalition, kind of unity and umbrella, very much, kind of using the rhetoric of the Communist Party in order to represent a subcultural group. Another word for Chinese word for queer, in a kind of literal transliteration, is called ku-er, very much, sounding like the English word queer. So here you have, sort of a whole series of kind of pride movement, very much part of subcultural movement. So what I've been talking about then is a few things. With literature, we're talking about alternative, countercultural movement, opposition, rebellious writing. With cinema, we're talking about a kind of art house movement, into the West. These films, Chen Geiger's films, are not very popular in China, at least not the old ones anyway, right? So an art house movement, and, with the queer subculture is very much just subcultural kind of movement with changing representations of new sexuality. But I think what is most, kind of unique and to China is this new kind of sexuality I'm talking about. It's not just subculture, alternative culture, or avant-garde. It's very much mainstream televisual culture. In 2005, Li Yuqin, Chris Lee, won the China's equivalent of the Australian Idol, the Super Girl competition, and she became this huge success. In 2005, she made the cover of Time magazine, and Time hailed her as one of the top 10 most influential people of the region. And in the Time magazine article, she was in a section, called Iconoclast. She was just famous for being herself. That was what Time magazine said. And to the point, she's so famous, she's now in New Chinese Pride. He has Olympic, kind of torch bearer. But if you see Chris Lee and her image, right, she has a tomboy persona. She's a self-confessed tomboy. She won the competition with this image, right? Her voice is gender neutral, but she sings all the male covers of male songs, right? She dresses in men's suits most of the time on stage. In everyday life, very much, kind of t-shirt and men's shoes. And in some of the videos, you can see her wearing baggy t-shirt with hip-hop and all of that, with a motorbike and all, very much kind of flat-chested. So this kind of male persona has become this huge, massive, kind of popular icon, national pride in China. Just to give you a sense of the kind of national icon. On the finals itself, right, we have an audience base of 400 million viewers. That is 1/3 of Chinese population. And 400 million viewers is bigger than the population of North America or United Nations. So just to give you a sense of how many people watch the actual television series and the finals, and how many people voted. 8 million phone messages. So you can't really vote in China, but you can, text in messages of support, right? 8 million SMS messages. And this program is organized by Hunan Television Company, which is not the region, not the Shanghai, Beijing one. It's a very regional one. So it allowed regional people to actually be participants, and apart from the huge advertising and franchise, profits, from this program, Hunan Television, from SMS texting alone, $38 million US dollars. So this is that kind of huge, massive popularity of this phenomenon. So when I talk about this tomboy, I'm not talking about a subcultural thing. I'm talking about, a kind of massive appeal here. And I've got more quotes too. Internet traffic, right? Something like, the weeks before and after the finals, 51 million posting at a rate of something like 5 posting. 3.3 messages every second. That's the kind of traffic that's generated on the internet. So what kind of femininity is this, and how has somebody like that actually managed to capture the huge kind of psyche and emotional sentiment of huge population of China? So her fan base, right, from grandmothers to young women, both men and male and female as well. So what kind of femininity are we talking about? Here, I talk about this tomboy idol because she uses the term, she's a self-confessed tomboy. So what is tomboy in relation to new femininity, right? Is it gender deviant, gender ambiguous, or Judith Halberstam, a very famous queer theorist, says it's a union of maleness and femaleness. So we're talking about male and female, like the Nandan I was talking about coming together. And this kind of combination of maleness and femaleness is evident in this ad, a 2005 ad that Chris Lee did for the Amoy phone company on a mobile phone. Those of you who can't read Chinese, the caption says, what does it say? Absolute straight and handsome, peerless. That's the caption for the ad, right? So absolute straight, absolute feminine, and masculine at the same time. So you see this kind of combination of maleness and femaleness coming together. That's the new kind of femininity that we're talking about. That's captured the whole generation of new Chinese fans. So, of course, this kind of tradition comes from the kind of cross-dressing tradition in Chinese opera too. Before I talked about male-to-female cross-dressing, female to male cross-dressing, the Fan Chuan tradition, made most famous by the woman warrior Hua Mulan. So that kind of cross-dressing is also very much part of Chinese history. But also what Chris Lee does in all of these is that she actually challenges, traditional representations of Chinese femininity. So in the 1930s, the 1920s, 1930s, in the new cultural movement, you get the emergence of the new modern, Shanghai women. They're modern and they're independent, but, they're still subsumed under patriarchy, very much, kind of representing the kind of the new China independent of imperial forces. In Mao's China from the 1950s to 1970s, the new kind of Iron Maiden was very much, kind of championed by Mao Zedong as part of state feminism. Oh, women are equal, women hold up half the sky, that kind of a mantra. But women are supposed to be like men, they're completely kind of desexualized. And then the new era onwards, from the 1980s onwards, the emergence of the new kind of femininity typified by the beauty writers that I've talked about, sexually, active, voluptuous, elegant, feminine. And what Chris Lee does then is to really challenge all these representations and to provide a new kind of image, a new kind of role model for all her millions of fans. The fans, go online to say, she's my princess, right? She's handsome. I want to be with her for the rest of my life. On her blog pages, fans will post, a whole lot of, messages, but with headings is like, I love her. She's my woman. I want to, sort of be with her. But this kind of same-sex identification, right? The fans, adore her and love her because they want to be like her. So that is very different to, the kind of lesbian identification that we know of in the West. They want to be like her, right? So one fan actually talks about, she represents the ultimate femininity. She's casual, she's unassuming, she's humble, she doesn't put on makeup. She represents a new kind of liberated, kind of image for all of us to that we can be, we don't have to be sexualized, we don't need to be elegant and voluptuous and put on makeup all the time, we can be like her. So this kind of tomboy femininity that she represents becomes this kind of new ideal femininity for a new generation of women. So, we can say, a new role model for young women to refashion new identities. So I've, kind of talked about China in all sorts of ways with all sorts of different forces. So, China has a new economic might, has a kind of new soft cultural power. The impact of China has also changed global representations of Chinese sexuality as well. None so than in Australia. In Australia, we have the Mao's Last Dance, so you've all seen the film. The film is number 3 in the all-time Australian film box office record. Last year it was number 1 in the box office. So in the history of Australian cinema, this is the 3rd film to have made the most amount of money after Crocodile Dundee and Baz Luhrmann's Australia. So it's a very significant film. But what was most significant for me was that it showed a new representation of the Chinese man. In the film, I'm sure we all cried, but all of us also looked at, this Chi Chao, the male dancer, his male body, he was stripping, you could see his muscles, he was sexy, he was sexually active, and that's a new kind of representation of Chinese masculinity that we are seeing on the screen in Australia. And that's very different to the existing representation of Chinese masculinity in Australia, Asian masculinity. I mean, here I've got there, the gangster stereotype, the cook stereotype. If they are in an racial relationship, they're always the passive lover of a white woman. In the 2003 Japanese story, Toni Collette, plays the female protagonist, and she has a Japanese lover. When they're having sex, right, the Toni Collette character is on top of the Japanese man, right? So these are the kind of tradition, existing representations of Asian masculinity in Australia, desexualized, passive. But this film, Mao's Last Dancer, we can see a completely different image. So I think, in part because we're seeing a strong China, we're seeing a China with changing representations of sexuality, and that kind of changing impact has its impact on the Chinese diaspora in different parts of the world, and it's starting to change, other cultural forms everywhere as well. So literally what I've talked about is just changing policies and the globalization of China. They have actually produced new sexual cultures. And these new sexual cultures, they challenge the socialist tradition, they challenge existing traditions. They are so influenced by, Western and Eastern kind of flows. And new sexual cultures, provide an arena for the, current generation to reform and remake, new identities to the point that, it is impacted upon in the diaspora. So thanks very much.